A retired veteran signed the divorce papers, gave up every dollar, every asset, and walked away with nothing but an abandoned shack and a German shepherd. People thought he had lost everything. They didn't know God sometimes removes comfort to reveal destiny. What waited inside that rotting cabin was not ruin, but a secret powerful enough to change who lives and who dies. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. The house stood quiet at the edge of town, winter light pressing against its windows, holding the weight of a marriage ended, a war unfinished, and a man who no longer knew where home truly was. The divorce papers lay on the kitchen table like an unexploded shell, silent, unassuming, yet capable of tearing a life apart with one careless touch. He signed them without argument, without hesitation, without asking for more time. That, more than anything else, seemed to confuse everyone. Friends expected anger. Lawyers expected negotiations. His wife expected resistance, maybe a final attempt to fight for something already slipping away. Instead, he slid the pen back across the table with a steady hand, as if acknowledging an order rather than ending a life he once believed would last. He left her everything. The savings they had built together, the car, the furniture chosen on weekends that now felt borrowed from another version of himself. He did not argue, did not bargain, did not look back. He kept only one thing, the house. Not because it was worth much, it wasn't. Not because it was convenient, it stood too far from work, from people, from distraction. He kept it because his father had placed the keys into their hands on their wedding day and said quietly and without ceremony, "Whatever happens, this place is yours." His father had been wrong about many things in life, but not about this. Some places were not meant to be shared, they were meant to be endured. At night the house changed. The walls creaked in unfamiliar rhythms, as if remembering arguments spoken too softly to ever be resolved. Shadows stretched longer than they should have, and the silence grew heavy, pressing against his ears until his own breathing sounded foreign. Sleep never arrived gently. It came like an ambush, sudden, violent, and incomplete. PTSD did not announce itself with explosions or obvious terror. It lived in the pause between heartbeats, in the way silence felt hostile, in how a dropped glass could snap his body into readiness before his mind caught up. He had survived war. That part was easy to explain. What he could not survive, what had slowly dismantled his marriage, was coming home without ever truly returning. She had tried. He never doubted that. She learned to read the signs, the tightening of his jaw, the way his eyes measured exits, the stiffness in his back when touched unexpectedly. She learned which questions to avoid, which memories to let die quietly between them. But love, no matter how patient, could not compete with a mind that still lived in combat zones. When she finally said, "I don't know how to reach you anymore," he nodded. Because neither did he. The German shepherd stayed. There was no discussion, no paperwork, no emotional negotiation. The dog simply remained, as if the decision had never been in doubt. It slept near the bedroom door, not inside, not far, close enough to listen, distant enough to respect space. Its loyalty was not loud or demonstrative. It did not ask to be thanked. Some nights, when tremors ran through his hands for no visible reason, the dog would rise and place itself between him and the darkness, facing outward, alert, as if the threat were real. Sometimes, in his worst moments, he believed it was. He stopped counting days and started counting what he no longer needed. No television, no news, no phone calls unless absolutely necessary. The world had become too sharp, too loud. He drove his old taxi during daylight hours, just enough to keep the electricity on and food in the kitchen. He preferred passengers who talked endlessly, filling the space so he wouldn't have to. He preferred roads over conversations. Driving was the only place his thoughts lined up neatly, one after another, like vehicles in a controlled convoy. But even that began to feel less like healing and more like hiding. One evening, as winter settled deeper into the bones of the house, he found himself standing in the doorway of the spare room. It had once been intended as a nursery, then quietly converted into storage, then abandoned altogether. He didn't remember deciding to go in. He only remembered the sound, a faint hollow shift beneath his boot. The floorboard moved, barely, just enough to feel wrong. The dog's ears lifted instantly, not in curiosity, but in warning. He knelt and pressed his palm against the wood. It was loose, not broken. Removed once, carefully, and replaced by someone who intended to return. He pried it up slowly. Beneath it, scratched into the concrete with deliberate, uneven lines, was a sequence of numbers and letters. No explanation, no date, no name, just an address, or something pretending to be one. The dog released a low sound, not a growl, not a bark, but something older and more instinctive. His first impulse was to cover it back up, to pretend he had never seen it. He had spent years mastering the art of not looking too closely at things that might demand something from him. But this felt different. This felt like his father who fixed engines without manuals and believed silence was a form of respect. His father who disappeared on certain weekends and returned quieter than before, carrying something he never spoke about. His father who had died with too many unanswered questions. He replaced the board and sat on the floor, his back against the wall, the coordinates echoing in his thoughts like a pulse. The house no longer felt empty. That night, sleep never came. He lay awake listening to the dog's steady breathing, unafraid, unwavering. He wondered if this was what loyalty looked like when it wasn't spoken aloud, if this was what love became when it stopped trying to save and simply chose to stay. He thought of his ex-wife without bitterness, only clarity. She had not failed him. He had not failed her. They had simply reached the edge of what two people could carry together. Some battles were meant to be fought alone. By morning, the decision had already been made. He packed lightly, without plans or expectations. The coordinates were folded once and slipped into his jacket pocket. He filled the dog's bowl, locked the house, and stood on the porch longer than necessary, as if listening for something the walls might want to say. The house watched him leave. The dog followed without hesitation. For the first time in years, the road ahead did not feel like escape. It felt like a beginning. The road narrowed as the town disappeared behind him, winter hills rising ahead, the taxi engine humming steadily, the world thinning into distance until only silence, motion, and memory remained. He drove without a destination that felt complete, following the coordinates folded in his jacket pocket as if they were less directions than permission to leave. The old taxi carrying him away from the life he had signed off from and toward something he did not yet have words for. There was no radio playing, no phone vibrating with missed calls, only the low mechanical rhythm of the engine and the quiet presence of the German shepherd behind him, alert but calm, as if it understood this was not a retreat but a necessary withdrawal. The further he went, the more the noise inside him softened, not disappearing, but loosening its grip. The constant edge of vigilance easing into something closer to awareness. He passed stretches of road where there were no houses, no signs, no human imprint beyond asphalt cutting through frozen earth, and for the first time in years the absence of people did not feel like danger, but relief. In combat, isolation had meant vulnerability, but here it meant honesty. No one watching, no one expecting him to be anything other than what he was in that moment. The taxi, scarred by years of work and neglect, became a kind of confessional, its cracked dashboard and worn steering wheel absorbing thoughts he had never dared to speak aloud, thoughts about his marriage, about the way he had mistaken endurance for strength, about how survival had slowly replaced living without him noticing. When he stopped for fuel at a nearly abandoned station, The attendant barely looked up, and he was grateful for the invisibility, grateful that his past did not precede him here, that no one knew his rank, his service record, or the nights he still woke with his heart racing as if the war had simply changed locations. The dog shifted once when a truck passed too close, then settled again, its trust steady and unquestioning. A reminder that loyalty did not require explanations or promises. By late afternoon, he reached the edge of the land marked by the coordinates, a place where the road thinned into gravel and the air felt heavier, colder, as if the ground itself held onto secrets. He parked beside a small, neglected structure that barely qualified as a house, more shelter than home, its windows clouded with dust and time, its doors stiff from disuse, and he stood there longer than necessary, listening, scanning, waiting for the familiar surge of threat that never came. Instead, there was only stillness, deep and unbroken, the kind that did not ask anything of him. Inside, the space was bare, functional, forgotten, and he began to clean without urgency, sweeping debris, stacking what could be salvaged, letting the repetitive motions anchor him in the present, each movement a small act of order against the chaos that had ruled his thoughts for years. The dog moved through the space with quiet purpose, pausing at corners, watching doorways, its behavior less about fear than memory, as if it too understood that places like this were never just places. As daylight faded, he noticed how the silence outside differed from the silence in his old house, how this quiet did not echo with unresolved arguments or half-spoken apologies, but rested, patient and wide, leaving room for him to breathe. He cooked a simple meal, ate without distraction, and for the first time in a long while, the food tasted like something rather than obligation. Later, as he repaired a loose section of flooring near the back of the structure, his hand brushed against the edge of a board that did not belong, its placement too careful, its wear inconsistent with the rest, and the sensation sent a ripple through him, the old instinct stirring, not panic, but recognition. He did not lift it fully, not yet, but marked it in his mind, the way he once marked terrain, understanding that timing mattered as much as courage. That night he slept in fragments, but the dreams were quieter, less violent, the shadows less aggressive, and when he woke before dawn, he did so without the sharp jolt of fear that usually greeted him. Outside, the sky was pale and unforgiving, the land stretching out in all directions, indifferent and honest, and he realized that this isolation was doing something the world had failed to do for him, stripping away noise until only essentials remained. He thought about his father then, about the weekends he had disappeared, the silences he had never explained, and the way the coordinates felt less like an inheritance and more like a conversation interrupted too soon. The dog sat beside him as he stepped back into the cold morning air, its presence grounding him, reminding him that whatever waited ahead, he would not face it entirely alone. He reached into his jacket, touched the folded paper, and felt a subtle shift inside, not hope exactly, but readiness, the sense that something had been set in motion the moment he chose the road, instead of the familiar walls of regret. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the frozen ground, he understood that this place was not the destination, only the threshold, and that whatever his father had left behind was still waiting for him to decide how far he was willing to go. The cabin emerged from the trees at dusk, its silhouette steady against the fading light, as if it had been waiting, unchanged, for the exact moment he would finally arrive. He approached slowly, not because he sensed danger, but because his body had learned long ago that unfamiliar structures deserved patience, the gravel crunching beneath his boots, sounding louder than it should in the still air, the German shepherd pausing beside him with quiet focus rather than aggression, as if this place carried meaning instead of threat. The cabin did not look abandoned in the way forgotten buildings usually did. There was no sense of collapse or neglect, Only age held together by intention, and that unsettled him more than decay ever could. He raised his hand to knock, hesitated, then let it fall, unsure why the hesitation felt necessary, and before his knuckles could touch the wood, the door opened from the inside. A young woman stood there, her expression calm, neither surprised nor wary, as though she had heard his approach long before his footsteps reached the porch, and she smiled in a way that felt practiced but not false. "Welcome back," she said, her voice steady, not questioning, not cautious. And then, with a slight inclination of her head, she added words that struck him harder than any accusation could have. "The owner has returned." For a moment he forgot to breathe, the sentence colliding with memories he did not fully possess, with the coordinates folded in his pocket, with his father's silences, and he became acutely aware of the dog beside him, its posture alert but restrained, not intervening, not retreating, simply watching her with an intensity that suggested recognition rather than hostility. He told her she must be mistaken, that he had never been here before, that this cabin was not his. But she did not argue, did not correct him, only stepped aside to allow him entry, as if his denial were expected and irrelevant. Inside, the cabin was warmer than he anticipated, not in temperature, but in presence, as though it had been lived in recently, the space orderly without feeling staged, functional without being bare, and something in his chest tightened at the realization that this place had not been waiting empty. The woman spoke little as he took it in, explaining only what was necessary, that the cabin was a waypoint, that it belonged to a larger inheritance than land or structures, that her role was temporary by design, not ownership but stewardship, words that echoed his father's philosophy without ever mentioning his name. He asked how she knew him, how she knew when he would arrive, and she answered honestly by not answering at all, telling him instead that some paths were tracked forward rather than backward, that waiting was sometimes easier than searching, and that her instructions were simple: to hold what had been left until the right person stood at the door. The German shepherd moved through the cabin then, slow and deliberate, stopping near the hearth, then the back wall, its behavior not anxious but attentive, as if mapping a space it had visited before in another time. And the woman noticed this with a faint look of recognition that flickered and disappeared before he could question it. They shared a meal made from provisions already there, simple and unremarkable. Yet he felt an unfamiliar ease as they ate, the conversation light but deliberate, never straying into personal histories, never touching the war or the divorce or the fractures that had driven him here, as though she understood exactly which subjects would close him rather than open him. When he finally asked what awaited him beyond the cabin, she placed a folded map on the table between them and set an old compass beside it, its casing worn smooth by hands long gone, and told him only that the land kept records more honest than people, that the compass did not point north so much as it pointed true, and that he would understand the difference soon enough. He did not ask where she would be when he returned, and she did not offer an answer, but there was something final in the way she looked at him then, not sad, not relieved, but resolved, as if her task were nearing completion. That night, as he lay on a narrow bed listening to the wind move through the trees, he realized he was not afraid, not even uncertain, only aware that something old had shifted into alignment, that the sense of readiness he had felt on the road had sharpened into purpose. And when he woke before dawn to find the cabin quiet, and the woman gone without a trace of departure, he understood that the door opening had never been the mystery. It was the waiting that mattered, and whatever lay ahead would not offer guidance so freely again. Morning light revealed the cabin emptied of presence, the air colder, the silence sharper, as if the land itself had inhaled and was now waiting for him to decide whether he would listen or turn away. He stood in the doorway longer than necessary, absorbing the absence the woman had left behind, not confusion, but a precise kind of quiet, the kind that followed a completed task, and he realized with an unsettling calm that she had never been meant to stay beyond this moment. The map and compass lay where she had placed them, untouched by the night, and when he lifted the compass, he felt the weight of hands that had trusted it before his own, not sentimental weight, but functional, earned through use. The German shepherd circled the cabin once, slow and deliberate, then stopped near the back wall, ears forward, posture attentive, not alarmed, as though confirming something it already knew. He folded the map carefully and stepped outside, the mountain air cutting clean through him, sharpening his thoughts instead of dulling them, and began the walk indicated by markings that seemed less like directions and more like reminders. The terrain resisted him in small, honest ways, loose gravel, narrow paths, branches stiff with cold, and with each step his breathing settled into a rhythm that felt familiar, echoing long marches where purpose mattered more than comfort. He found the entrance just before noon, not dramatic, not hidden behind clever disguises, simply overlooked by anyone not meant to see it, a dark opening cut into rock that bore the marks of old work rather than collapse, and the sight stirred something deep in him, a recognition that bypassed logic. The compass needle shifted when he crossed the threshold, not wildly, but enough to make him pause, and he remembered the woman's words about truth, about directions that did not align with conventional expectations, and for the first time since his discharge, he felt that same quiet clarity he used to feel before missions, the moment when doubt fell away and only responsibility remained. He did not enter immediately, choosing instead to observe, to note the air, the ground, the subtle signs of human passage long past, and the German shepherd mirrored this caution, staying close, eyes tracking the darkness with disciplined restraint. He marked the location, committed it to memory, then turned back toward the road, understanding that instinct without preparation was not courage, but arrogance. The drive into town felt different than his earlier departure, as if he were crossing a boundary in reverse, carrying knowledge instead of shedding it, and the small hardware store greeted him with fluorescent light and the faint smell of oil and dust, ordinary in a way that grounded him. The clerk asked no questions beyond what was necessary, and he answered in kind, purchasing rope, lights, gloves, tools for measuring and marking, all the mundane objects that transformed uncertainty into manageable risk. On the drive back, he considered returning to the cabin to look for the woman, to ask the questions he had not asked. But as the structure came into view, empty and unchanged, he understood the futility of that impulse. There were no tracks, no signs of hurried departure, no evidence she had ever occupied the space beyond what she had chosen to leave behind. And the realization settled heavily, but without fear, an acceptance that some guides did not walk beside you, only pointed once and stepped away. Inside the cabin he prepared carefully, laying out equipment with the methodical precision that had once kept him alive. And the German shepherd watched without interfering, its presence steady, its trust absolute, a silent agreement that whatever lay ahead would be faced together. The descent into the mine was colder than he expected, the darkness swallowing sound, amplifying the scrape of boots against stone, and he moved slowly, deliberately, letting the beam of his light reveal what it chose, rather than forcing understanding too quickly. The walls bore the marks of labor rather than violence, careful cuts, reinforced beams, evidence of planning rather than desperation, and he felt a growing respect for whoever had worked here, whoever had chosen patience over profit. Deeper inside, he found remnants of the past, tools left in place, symbols carved with intention, and then something that shifted the weight of the space entirely, a brittle, yellowed newspaper pinned between boards, its edges curled, its headline half-faded but legible enough to chill him, reporting a mining incident, decades old, men who entered and never returned, questions left unanswered, responsibility never assigned. He folded the paper carefully, aware that this was not just history, but warning. And when he looked back toward the entrance, the light seemed farther away than it should have been, the distance stretched by more than physical space. He did not panic, but a familiar tension settled into his shoulders, the awareness that knowledge carried consequences, and that uncovering truth often meant stepping into someone else's unfinished story. By the time he emerged back into daylight, the sun had begun to sink, shadows lengthening across the ground like fingers reaching inward, and he felt the quiet certainty that this place was no longer just an inheritance, but a responsibility that would not release him easily. The German shepherd stood close, body angled outward, scanning the tree line with renewed intensity, and for the first time since their arrival, its calm carried an edge, not fear, but anticipation. He secured the cabin, stored the equipment, and sat with the folded newspaper in his hands, understanding that the next step would require answers he could not find alone, answers tied to his father's past and the people who had known him before silence became habit. As night settled in, the mountains seemed to close around the cabin, not hostile, but watchful, and he realized that whatever the woman had been guarding, whatever had been hidden here, was now his to confront, and that the truth would not reveal itself without resistance. The town appeared small and ordinary beneath a pale sky, a place where nothing dramatic was supposed to happen, and yet he arrived knowing that answers were often hidden where people believed nothing important remained. He drove into town with the folded newspaper secured in his jacket and a small bundle of samples wrapped carefully in cloth, the weight of them less physical than psychological, as though carrying proof that the past was not finished with him. The German shepherd remained alert in the back seat, not restless, not aggressive, but watchful in the particular way that came from experience rather than instinct alone, a posture that reminded him uncomfortably of patrols where the danger was never obvious until it was too late. He parked near a modest workshop on the edge of town, a place his father had once mentioned in passing, not with fondness or resentment, but with the neutrality reserved for people whose importance lay in what they knew rather than who they were. The man who opened the door was older now, time having softened his movements without dulling his eyes, and when he saw the soldier standing there, recognition arrived slowly, then settled with a visible weight. The reunion was restrained, words exchanged carefully, each measuring the other for changes that could not be undone, and when the soldier explained why he had come, he did not mention the mine at first, only that he had found something belonging to the past and needed help understanding it. Inside the workshop, surrounded by tools and half-finished repairs, the air carried the scent of oil and metal, grounding him in something tangible, something real. And as he laid the newspaper and samples on the table, the older man's expression tightened in a way that confirmed more than it denied. The article was read in silence, fingers tracing the faded text, pausing over names that had not been spoken aloud in years, and when the man finally looked up, the soldier understood that he had crossed an invisible line. The explanation came slowly, fragmented at first, about the mine, about rumors that had circulated decades earlier, about men hired under the pretense of protection who had instead ensured no one returned, and about his father, who had been closer to uncovering the truth than anyone realized. The German shepherd shifted then, placing itself between the soldier and the older man without a sound, not threatening, simply asserting presence, and the reaction was immediate, the man stiffening, his gaze flicking to the dog with something that resembled unease rather than fear. The soldier noticed this and stored it away, another detail that did not belong to coincidence. When asked directly about his father's disappearance, the man hesitated just long enough to fracture trust, insisting he had tried to warn him that circumstances had been beyond his control, that powerful interests had been involved, but the explanations felt rehearsed, shaped by time rather than truth. As the conversation continued, the German Shepherd remained tense, its attention unwavering, as though responding to something the soldier could not hear, and for the first time, doubt took root not about the mine, but about the man sitting across from him. He thanked him politely, accepted what limited information was offered, and left without confrontation, understanding that certainty did not always arrive through confession, but through pattern. Outside, the air felt heavier, the town less benign, and as he returned to the taxi, he replayed the interaction with the precision he once applied to debriefings, cataloging pauses, deflections, the subtle shift in tone when certain names were spoken. The dog relaxed only once they were moving again, its vigilance easing just enough to signal that the immediate threat had passed, but not vanished. Back at the cabin, he spread out everything he had gathered, the newspaper, the samples, the fragments of testimony, and the map, and for hours he cross-referenced memory with quiet observation, piecing together a story that refused to stay buried. His father had not been careless, nor unlucky. He had been close, too close, and someone had decided that silence was preferable to exposure. The realization did not ignite anger, as he might have expected, but resolve, cold and focused, the kind that narrowed his vision until only the next necessary step remained. The German Shepherd lay nearby, resting but attentive, its presence a steady reminder that loyalty did not question intent, only action. And as night fell, the mountain seemed less distant than before, its silence no longer neutral, but charged. He understood now that the mine was not just a place of inheritance, but a contested ground, guarded not by ghosts or myth, but by men willing to erase obstacles, and that returning unprepared would be an invitation rather than an investigation. As he secured the cabin for the night, checking the perimeter with care he had hoped to leave behind, he accepted that the search for truth had shifted into something else entirely, something that would not allow retreat without consequence. The final thought that followed him into uneasy sleep was not of danger, but of inevitability. The sense that the moment he had shown the newspaper to the wrong person, the mountain had stopped waiting and begun watching in return. Dawn broke cold and colorless as sirens climbed the mountain road, the mine breathing out silence again, while the truth, long buried, finally began to surface into the open air. He did not run when the sound reached him, because there was nowhere left to run to, only ground to hold and a choice to make. And as he steadied himself against the rock face near the mine entrance, pain pulsing with every breath, he understood that survival had carried him far enough to face the end honestly. The German Shepherd remained beside him despite its injury, body angled outward toward the tree line, not retreating, not collapsing, driven by something deeper than instinct, as if the memory of another man, another promise, still lived inside it and refused to loosen its grip. The mercenaries did not emerge in force again. They had learned enough underground to know that speed now worked against them, that visibility meant accountability. And as the first patrol vehicles appeared below, their confidence fractured into calculation. One of them stepped into view briefly, weapon lowered not in surrender, but in assessment, confirming what had already shifted, that the situation was no longer controllable, and then he disappeared back into the trees, leaving behind only evidence and intention. The soldier focused on staying upright, on keeping pressure against the wound, on the slow grounding rhythm of the dog's breathing, and in that narrow space between pain and awareness, memories surfaced with an unexpected clarity. His father's silence, his insistence on patience, the way he had spoken about land as something borrowed rather than owned. Lessons that had seemed abstract until now. When the first officers reached him, their approach cautious but professional, he raised his hands without resistance, not because he felt defeated, but because the fight he had chosen was never meant to end in secrecy. Questions came quickly, layered with urgency, and he answered only what was necessary at first, pointing instead toward the mine, toward the evidence left behind, toward the men who had believed violence could erase responsibility. Medical attention followed, efficient and detached, and as he was treated, he watched the German Shepherd being carefully lifted and carried by strangers who moved with respect rather than fear, their voices softer than expected, as though they understood they were handling something more than an injured animal. Hours passed in fragments, statements taken, radios crackling with updates, the mountain gradually filling with people whose presence felt intrusive yet inevitable, and as investigators descended into the mine, the weight of what had been hidden there for decades finally broke free from isolation. Names were spoken aloud that had once existed only in rumor, contracts uncovered that confirmed what instinct had warned him about, and when the old friend of his father was mentioned over a radio channel, his involvement no longer speculative but documented, the soldier felt no satisfaction, only a quiet release, the end of a question that had haunted him without ever fully forming. By the time he was transported down the mountain, the sun was high enough to cast hard shadows, and the cabin receded behind him, not as a place of refuge, but as a marker, a point where the past had finally stopped circling itself. The German Shepherd survived the journey, though its condition remained uncertain, and he sat nearby during the long wait that followed, speaking to it not in words of comfort, but in steady presence, the same way it had stayed with him when language failed. Officials returned later with documents rather than weapons, explaining in careful terms that the land and the mine were now under legal protection, that ownership had been confirmed, that what his father had preserved was recognized not just as property, but as a site of historical significance. And when he was handed the formal acknowledgement of inheritance, it felt less like a reward and more like a burden, accepted willingly. He thought of his marriage then, of the house he had given up without argument, of the life he had stripped down to essentials because excess had felt dishonest. And he realized that this inheritance was not a contradiction of that choice, but its continuation. The dog recovered slowly, never leaving his side once it could stand again, its resilience quiet and uncelebrated, and when he finally returned to the mountain days later, not alone but accompanied by those tasked with preservation rather than extraction, he felt no urge to reclaim the past, only to ensure it could no longer be misused. The mine was sealed with care, not erased but protected, the cabin secured and documented, and as he stood there one last time, the wind moving through the trees with the same indifference it always had, he understood that the story did not end in victory or loss, but in alignment, the moment when truth, responsibility, and choice finally pointed in the same direction. The German Shepherd settled beside him, eyes forward, posture calm, and in that shared stillness he felt something he had not allowed himself to feel since before the war, not peace exactly, but legitimacy, the knowledge that he had honored what was entrusted to him, that the mountain had kept its secret long enough, and that letting it go now was not surrender, but completion. Here is a final closing message written in English, designed to resonate emotionally and spiritually with an older audience, gently invoking faith, everyday life, and a clear call to action. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not arrive with thunder or fire. They come quietly, hidden in patience, in loyalty, in the courage to do what is right when no one is watching. This story reminds us that God often works through ordinary people, guiding them step by step, even when the path feels lonely or unfair. What looks like loss may be protection. What feels like delay may be preparation, and what we think is buried forever may be waiting for the right heart to uncover it. In our daily lives, we may not face mountains or hidden mines, but we all face moments where faith is tested, where integrity costs us comfort, and where love asks us to stand firm. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on where God might be quietly working in your own life right now. Please share this story with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment to tell us what part moved you the most, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of faith, courage, and unseen miracles. May God bless you, protect you, and guide you wherever you are watching from, and may His peace walk with you long after this story ends.